Morning, everyone. We are ready for chapter 55, the penultimate chapter of the Treasure Hunter's Tale. Mrs. Beloved of the King studied the area near the lid. There doesn't seem to be a keyhole either, she said, looking puzzled. Just that odd little slot thing. Iron, who had been allowed to stay up because it was the summer holidays, leant forward and peered closer. There's something around the rim of the lid, he said. They look like markings. The grown-ups peered closer as they had not noticed these before. Bravo, Iron, said Mr. Saved by Grace. You had better decipher what they mean, he said, taking off his glasses and passing them to Iron. Iron was so excited, for this was the first time he had got to use the special glasses, and he hoped more than anything that the markings would have some significance and would not just be a pattern on the rim of the lid. He peered intently for a while and then straightened up. They look like tally marks, like the ones we make at school, he said. Maybe it's a code, squealed Hope, who had always loved the story of how her grandmother had left a coded message on the cabin bed in the galley so very long ago, and how her mother and Freddie had found the coded message on the cabin bed and left one for the future prisoners, and how now it turned out that Freddie's wife had seen that message when she was on board, and how it had led her to the king. I should think so, said Mrs. B of good courage. She had taken herself into a cosy corner to feed Zeke, but she was now winding him, and he would soon settle for a good sleep, so she was excited to discover what the code said. Paper! We need paper, said Mr. Newhart, clapping his hands. And the king's book, said Mrs. Beloved of the King. And coffee, said Miss Wait-on-the-Lord, for I see this turning into a long night. The whole room was buzzing. Everyone was doing something to help, and then Iron put the glasses back on and began to read out the code. This is what it looked like. See if you can figure it out before reading on, if you'd like. You might need a separate bit of paper. Hopefully I've held that long enough so that if you wanted to pause it, you can try and figure it out. It took them some time to figure it out, as they eventually realised that some of the tallies were in fact signifying numbers which had been confusing at first. It's a reference, said Mrs. Beloved of the King, turning in her Bible. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25 to 29 is the key, said Mr. Newhart. He read it out, but the gathering around the kitchen table were none the wiser as to its significance in this particular case. I know being married is wonderful, said Mr. Newhart, looking at his wife, but I don't see it being the key to the reason or whatever it says. Freddie, who like most new husbands had been playing with his ring while he thought, suddenly slapped his hand to his forehead. That's it, he cried, and then turning to his love, Darling, I need your ring, he said excitedly. Mrs. B of good courage looked at him quizzically, but as he held out his hand, having already taken his ring off, it suddenly became clear to her. Our rings, announced Freddie, holding them up, have that message inside them. Maybe they are the key. It was a bit of a nerve-wracking moment, as it was now clear that in order to open the chest, the rings had to be pushed through the small slot, and this meant risking losing their wedding rings if their theory wasn't right. Freddie hesitated. Mrs. B of good courage came up behind him and put her arms around his waist. My love, she said quietly, it is not our rings that are precious, but the promises we have made to one another before the king, she said firmly. Freddie kissed his wife, and together they pushed their rings through the slot. They were a perfect fit, and they heard a definite clunk that sounded like an ancient unlocking mechanism when they pushed them through. The lid opened. Freddie breathed a sigh of relief and quickly retrieved the rings and placed his on his finger and his wife's on hers. I did not enjoy that, he said firmly. I know it's our promises that are precious, but I did love how special our rings were too, and I'm very grateful to have mine back, he said, reddening slightly. Me too, confessed his wife. And now for the treasure, cried Iron and Hope together. They all peered inside, but instead of seeing anything shiny, there was just a whole load of legal-looking documents. As they took them out one by one, they noticed the seal on each one was different. One read male and female, another read man and wife, another read language, another clothing, and so on. Indeed, there were many documents and many seals, and each one seemed to be stamped with a very fundamental truth of life, from working for a living and family and all sorts. The group looked at one another, still puzzled. Inside this chest lies the reason, said Mr. Saved by Grace slowly. He unravelled the document he had in his hand, which had the seal and stamp of the word clothing. He read it out. It's a Bible verse, he said. It says, to Adam and his wife Eve, the Lord made coats of animal skins and clothed them. He looked up. Well, that's in Genesis, he said. Freddie read his, which had the seal and stamp of language. It was much longer. It's basically most of the chapter of Genesis 11, he said. Mine's from Genesis 2, said Hope. Her document had the seal and stamp of male and female. And mine, said Mrs. Beloved of the King. Mine too, said Miss Wait-on-the-Lord. Indeed, all the ancient legal documents which were signed and sealed with the king's own seal were from the book of Genesis, from chapter 1 all the way through to chapter 11. The group looked at one another, still slightly puzzled. I think we need help discovering this, sighed Mr. Newhart. Everyone nodded in agreement. And we'll find out what that is tomorrow in the last chapter, God willing.